We can start.
Probably we can start, and then I will introduce our speaker. So our speaker today is Dr. Glen Segell. Dr. Segell is a professor at the University of Cambridge and visiting professor at the University of the Free State in South Africa. And the title of the paper is Anthropology and Counterinsurgency, Breaking the Cycle of Violence in Iraq, 2003-2010. So, Dr. Segell, you are welcome.
Thank you very much for having invited me to present at your International Center of Anthropology. It's a great honor at the National Research University High School of Economics in Moscow, Russia. It's a well-respected, renowned and famous organization and center. Indeed, I'd like to thank Dr. Consoliatis and for having organized this. We've done quite a number of projects in the past together with the University of the Free State, and all very successful, including working with students. Let me delve into the topic today. When I say breaking the cycle of violence, I'm referring to the tribal violence within Iraq. I'm not referring to the American-led coalition which toppled Saddam and the Ba'ath Party. But we must understand that the cycle of tribal violence in Iraq was as a consequence of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party being removed by the American-led coalition. So in this instance, solving one problem led to the creation of another. And for all intents and purposes, this is happening very frequently around the world. It's not something new that if you remove and have foreign intervention, then you create local problems. And I think this is very, very applicable to anthropology. Well, one of the mainstays of anthropological research around the world is understanding how a foreign culture, foreign element, foreign country intervenes in local affairs, and as a consequence, local affairs are disrupted, leading to a change. I'm going to devolve here into two different parts of my presentation today. The first part is going to very much look at anthropology, the applicable theories, the understanding of the event. And then the second part, I'm going to actually look at the case and present a lot of data. So if we start off on the first part, which is the theory part, the theory and its relevance to the case. Anthropology confronts very, very basic questions of human existence and survival. And the very, very start of that is how we originated. And the study of anthropology constantly, and the research of anthropology constantly compares customs of one society with others. Now this leads to a question in terms of definitions. For example, what is society? And indeed, if we're using different languages, we also have to apply them to translate to other languages. So I'm speaking in English, and society in English comes from organized life in groups, which means more than one individual and more than a family. So it's building from the individual to the family, to a group, to society. And once you have a larger element, you can call it tribal because there's a larger element there. What is culture? Well, culture is traditions, something which is regularly used, customs, which includes beliefs. And these govern the various behaviors and beliefs on a day-to-day existence. So this is how we originated, because the basis of our culture and the basis of society is progressive over a long period of time. But anthropology also looks into how we have changed. It doesn't remain stagnant. It's a constant move. And one of the understandings of the research and study of anthropology is to see why things have changed, how they've changed, and if that change has been influenced internally or externally, and indeed how we are changing still. Now, for my presentation today, I'm going to look at two applicable subdisciplines of anthropology, and they influence each other. They are mutually dependent and independent. The first one is what we can define as linguistic anthropology. This involves a lot of description, comparison, historical study of language, and of linguistic similarities and differences in time, space, and society. It considers how speech varies with social factors and over time. And its relevance to the case study is because a large part of what we'll be dealing with in our case study on Iraq and tribal violence is the psychological warfare operation of the United States to break that cycle of violence. And the use of words and wording and how these were interpreted by the different groups in the violence was very important. For example, you could call Al-Qaeda, as we know, a terrorist organization, but you could also, on the other hand, from others' perspective, call it a liberation organization. And Al-Qaeda was, by in many instances, called the terrorist organization, but it was Sunni Islam. And this compares to Shia Islam. Now, Shia Islam, they referred more to the same type of activities of violence as militia groups. So there's a lot of linguistics involved in terms of this. For those who are not aware of the study of Islam, Sunni is majority and Shia is a minority. And this goes back to the very, very earliest days of the study of Islam by people who believed in it. The Sunni believed that for all intents and purposes that Muhammad was the last prophet. And the Shia, who came about very, very shortly after Muhammad's death, were more believing that something else followed rather than him being the last prophet, but it also related to a period of time called the Caliphate and Abu Bakr, where the Shia actually were the poorer people who rose up against the Sunni, which were the richer people. So there's a lot of elements involved in the difference between Sunni and Shia. And it comes to play in Iraq, for instance, because the majority of the population are actually Shia in Iraq, but the majority of people around the world who believe in Islam are Sunni. So there's a lot of linguistics involved in the study of anthropology, of how to break the cycle of tribal violence. The second part, which I will also look at, is cultural anthropology. It's a study of human society, the different groups involved. And it wasn't just Sunni and Shia, because there was also Kurds involved and smaller groups as well. Describes and analyzes and interprets and explains social and cultural similarities. They're both Islam, but there are also those differences. So these are the two subfields which influence each other in the case study: linguistic anthropology and cultural anthropology. How does this actually relate to war, the tribal violence in the case study? Well, cultural anthropology describes, analyzes, and interprets and explains social and cultural similarities and differences. And the differences were what led to tribal violence. There's also ethnography, and this is the field work in that particular culture which provides account of their community, society, and culture. And ethnography was very important because for the 7 years that I was involved in the psychological warfare operations, we did a lot of field work to understand this. And I'm going to describe that field work in the case study, both quantitative and qualitative field work. Cultures are not isolated from local, regional, national, and global systems, politics, economics, and information that expose locals to external influences. So the culture of what was happening in Iraq was not isolated. It was something which was an extension of what was happening in the region and globally, and it was reciprocal. Whatever was happening in Iraq was also influencing the region, local, regional, and global. Anthropology to PSYOP. PSYOP is psychological operations warfare. Anthropology, until the Iraq War of 2003, was not actually a very strong field in any types of military research. But as a consequence of not being able to win the battle on the battlefield, the US and the coalition forces turned to anthropology as one of many ways to try and break the cycle of tribal violence in Iraq. And they found that anthropology and anthropologists could help them, us, understand the enemy through cross-cultural perspectives. The first is the data. It's a systematic field of study, or a body of knowledge. This is the research of anthropology and the output that aims, through experiments, observation, and deduction, to produce reliable explanation of phenomena with reference to the material and physical world. So until anthropologists came into the psychological warfare operation, the understanding of what was happening was very, very political, i.e. political science. They could have interpreted it one step further in terms of understanding the battle as a conflict just between two sides. But there was no understanding of the root causes, i.e. the cultural elements. And this is what anthropology brought to the battlefield, an understanding of the causes, not just the symptoms. In addition to data, there's also the analysis. For example, cultural anthropology, or what we could call psychological anthropology, studies cross-cultural variation in psychological traits. Hey, why do two different people living in the same city come to different decisions? And the answer, yeah, anthropology was bringing, because they have different cultures. They come from different societies. They come from different tribes. And therefore, their actions are going to be different, even though if they are neighbors across the street. Let me now get into the actual case. It's part 2. It was an insurgent situation, in fact. An insurgent was coming, Shiites were coming from Iran, and the Al-Qaeda was coming from around the region, from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen. And before the removal of the Ba'ath Party by the US-led coalition forces, there was neither an Al-Qaeda in Iraq, nor were there a strong Shia-led militia force. But once the Ba'ath Party and Saddam were removed, there was a strong battle. First of all, against the foreign forces, which were 45 countries led by the United States. Some were only 10, 20 soldiers, such as Japan, Australia, 250 soldiers. Others were far bigger contingents, like United Kingdom, 10,000 soldiers. And suddenly there was a second war there, called the insurgent situation. And that also led not only to the attempt to remove these foreign forces, but also led to tribal violence between Sunni and Shia, as well as Kurds. And that did not have any type of military solution that involved the entire population. The first stage was removal of Saddam, finished by May, June 2003, and by October of the same year, the United States Armed Forces Committee held a hearing, examined lessons learned from Operation Freedom, and there was a decision. In simple terms, if we had better understood, this is a quote, the Iraqi culture and mindset, emphasis here on culture, the different factions and tribes, and there is a mention of tribes, then our war plans would have been even better than they were. The plan for the post-war period and all its challenges would have been far better, and we would have been better prepared for the long slog to win the peace in Iraq. So yeah, in the United States Congress, they are talking about culture and tribes. And so it became very, very logical at the onset to look at who could assist them in that. And there came anthropology. What was the problem here? The problem is that the insurgents' organizational structure was not military. It wasn't a hierarchical military structure. It wasn't even a terrorist organization. It was purely tribal. The people fighting were fighting for their own homes, their own societies. And their tactics, therefore, were not actually entirely conventional. And this came to the actual statement that the war is asymmetrical. It is tanks, guns, and aircraft against a population. Something which I think quite a number of countries around the world in the last century knew all about, such as Vietnam, the United States, or Malaysia, for the United Kingdom, or indeed the entire case of decolonization efforts throughout Africa. The weapons are not tanks and fighters. They don't abide by any Geneva Conventions. They don't even know what these are in terms of law of wars. They're basically fighting for their own home or their survival. And similar to Vietnam, none of the elements of United States national power, diplomatic, military, intelligence, or economic, or even nuclear weapons could explicitly take advisory culture into account and formation of any times of policy. And this cultural knowledge gap had a simple cause. There was a total absence of anthropology within the United States and the entire 45-country coalition national security establishment. They had no understanding of the causes of what was happening. The solution statement was that to counter the insurgency in Iraq requires cultural and social knowledge of the adversary. In this case, many adversaries by the time they actually began to research it. And anthropology, the social science discipline, primary objective of study, and has traditionally been non-Western societies. That was the statement offered to them by researchers at West Point Military Academy. You have to look for anthropology. This is what it is. And one of the central epistemological tenets of anthropology is cultural relativism, understanding other societies from within their own framework. And so began an entire research program to understand that framework. And this was called the Human Terrain System, the HTS Pentagon Project. The goal was to research, to help military personnel better understand the local cultural context within Iraq. It had to have an output in order to get funding. The output was a military application. Success in war, especially tribal violence, isn't best achieved by overwhelming technological advantage or the use of massive force. And I think anybody who remembers back to those days, anybody doing research now, could well remember the phrase, winning the hearts and minds. And this was the military application. There were tools, weapons, and tactics. The tool would be ethnographic imagination to analyze a good versus evil, outlined based on culture. It was going to be a defensive tool, not just psychological warfare. There was the thinking about the ethnic religious partition of Baghdad through the building of physical security walls, divided and ruled. And they did this. There were checkpoints between different neighborhoods to keep the people apart. But in essence, this was creating something called gated communities. And nowhere in the world ever has a gated community ever succeeded. And it didn't in Baghdad either. This was an extent all the way up to 2007. There was a surge of almost 200,000 troops to Iraq. And there was also offensive weapons, in addition to the defense tool. And this was the use of PSYOP, psychological operations, and info-ops. Info-ops, information warfare operations, is different from psychological. Information weapon operations, for example, is to convince the local population why it is better for them not to go to war. In other words, who provides you with electricity, who provides you with water, and if you are blowing up these infrastructures, then you don't have any water or electricity. So it's basically for your own good of providing information. The tactics in all of these tools, weapons, and tactics was to appeal to support of population. In other words, was don't let your teenage children become actively involved in violence. Don't provide funding. Don't provide food to these people. Don't provide housing. In other words, reduce the number of people actively involved in tribal violence between Sunni and Shia against foreign coalition. And it swings like a pendulum. It was the moment we started, everybody else did. So there was a tug of war between our PSYOP and info-ops and everybody else's, including Iranian. So Iran also began involved in PSYOP to convince people, oh, we have to increase them. Al-Qaeda began its own psychological warfare operation. Let's look at the big picture now. This is what first stage was discovered in 2003. This is the first step of the research, the anthropological research. This was the continuum of tribal violence. There was a need to identify all the different tribes, tribal elements involved in the violence. So there was, going from left to right at the top of the screen, there was Sunni extremists, Sunni rejectionists, national resistance, civil society in the middle, and going to the right, tribal resistance, Shia rejectionists, and Shia extremists. And each of these had their little groups. So going back to the left-hand side, we find we have Sunni extremists had AKE, which was AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it goes all the way over to the right-hand side of the screen, which you see JAM, Jas el-Mahdi, which was the exact same version, but in Shia. And the first stage of the research, anthropological research, was to identify all the different groups involved in the anthropological framework that was needed to understand the cultures. In the middle of the screen, below the big picture, the colorful picture, you have GOI must block. That means government of Iraq must block terrorist and extremist group. People and government of Iraq must turn the cycle of violence. And there was a bit of research to see who was most likely that was able to do this better. It was the Sunni, the Shia, the Kurd, Al-Qaeda, Jas al-Mahdi, and the big red box at the bottom there, power struggle. This had to decrease. That was the big picture we had in 2003 of what was happening. But then we had to get further in depth to understand exactly what culture was behind this, the causes of this conflict, in order to break the cycle of tribal violence. So within a month or two, we began to move to where can we actually take each group within the tribal violence and lead it to an end state. So AQI on the left hand, AQI in Iraq end state, to have them reject violence and increase their active participation in local governance within each city. And the Shia militial end state on the other side of the screen was to have the exact same, reduce them into less violence and bring them into an element of governance. The problem was with the Shia was Iranian sponsorship and external intervention. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization franchised. The Shia militia, on the other hand, had state sponsorship. So we had two different tongues of war here. One, how to actually break a terrorist organization with a franchise group, Al-Qaeda, with no central leadership. And the Shia group, on the other hand, had central leadership sponsored through Tehran. And we found that there was a lot of people who go slightly below the three yellow blocks who were in the moderate middle. There was a neighborhood watch, there was armed and unarmed people in the neighborhood watch who didn't actually identify as either Sunni or Shia. They just wanted to have a good life. But in addition to that, there was also a lot of criminal gangs. We took advantage of the breakdown of governance created by American intervention to have an increase in crime. So we also had to introduce three different types of strategy, which is the bottom of the screen. An ideological type strategy in terms of each tribe, a behavioral strategy, and now we're looking at the mainstream individual in society who did not identify with the violence. We had to change their behavior, their culture, to understand that they should have a secular type of governance without in any way influencing their religious beliefs, i.e. a separation of religion and state very much in types of European types of framework. And we also had to have a political strategy to affect not just governance, but also a government. For example, a state of federalism, exploitation of fault lines, exposing of criminal and sectarian acts, delegitimize militias, and reduce popular support for the various groups. So the behavioral strategy is what we decided to focus on in psychological warfare operations, which was the culture of society. And that is a bottom-up, a pressure through mass media political campaign, TV, radio, news, print, videos, and so forth. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you a few video clips of which we made in order to actually do that bottom-up. So the PSYOP is looking at behavior, which is the culture of society. And more, the military, in terms of its tactics, was looking very much in terms to break it physically. Now, we had two different types of research methodology to do this. One was quantitative and one was qualitative. It was no different from what actually happens in academia. And in fact, many of the researchers which were involved in military operation were from academia. Vast majority of officers in the military nowadays in Western military have degrees, university degrees, and from a certain rank upwards you have masters, and from a certain rank up you even have a PhD. So quantitative and qualitative research is well taught and well understood by the officers involved. The quantitative we did was surveys and polls. We actually had a team in each area. I'm going to show you the results of it, who went around and did public opinion surveys to test the effectiveness of media campaigns. There was also a qualitative, which was actually interviews and focus groups. And we had a research project here. So the quantitative on one side of the screen was looking for monthly polls, and we had samples of N of 5,000 people. We did this with paper. In other words, individuals locally, we would pay them to go with a piece of paper, a clipboard, and a pencil and ask the questions. Because if the person asking the question is clearly seen and known in the neighborhood, he's safe. If you send somebody outside to ask these questions, you could quite easily expect that to be some sort of foreign spy or a foreign government intervening, and so his own life would be at risk. So generally speaking, it would be we're paying local students, local teenagers to ask questions so their own lives would not be threatened. A lot of the qualitative research, for example, focus groups and testing of our PSYOP products was done, for example, in hospitals. We would have the family members of people who were injured come into a room. We would pay them, we would show them the products, we would ask them the questions. And purpose is to evaluate the effectiveness. And the quantitative and qualitative, the yellow box, would together optimize our output. So we were constantly testing to see what things were happening. We had approximately 18 to 20 focus groups each month, and each had 6 or Sunni or Shia from target events. And we also had an atmospheric panel to type of research. The same people being asked constantly to see how their views and opinions had changed. Looking at the metrics of what did we obtain from it, and the best measure of effectiveness we found was uncoerced statement. So we were actually doing research the way you do it in market research, that a company who was trying to sell a product would test it whether do you buy Pepsi or do you buy Coca-Cola? It's the same type of question saying do you support Sunni or Shia? So the effectiveness of what we're doing is very much in terms of market research. And we actually brought in commercial market researchers. So we had what we call contractors, which were actually companies. Companies from the 45 members of the coalition who were commercial civilians. And these commercial civilians actually did this. So we had a cyber team, we had detainee interviews, we had on-the-street interviews, and these were done by commercial companies using local population. Now, this is an example in December 2006 of the type of research that we actually did. So yeah, we can show you how we split up Baghdad into different sectors, into Sunni, Shia, and mixed, different colors. And we were doing research to find an N sample in each area of the neighborhood to understand the ethno-sectarian incidents as a cause of the violence in that neighborhood. And in this month period, or month and a half period of research, we had 1,121 respondents, of which 54 were Shia, 25 Sunni, and no answer 21. So it was purely commercial market research. This, for example, is a monthly tribal violence national poll throughout the whole country. So in each neighborhood, each sector, or what we call province of the country, we had a team undertaking research. And the end sample, yeah, was 5,354 between the periods 10 to 29th of January 2007. And we were looking to understand what was happening, not just in major urban areas such as Baghdad, but in the different provinces, some of which we knew were 100% Sunni. For example, next to Baghdad, Diyala. However, if you had to go down to the south, the bottom right-hand corner, Maisan, areas such as that, very much in terms of Shia population. So we knew we were going to expect a difference. We also knew that the vast majority of violence was centered in the Baghdad urban area. Up north was Kurdish, and Diyala Anbar was what we called the Sunni triangle, which had to be broken because that's where Al-Qaeda was. And later, that is actually where the Islamic State migrated into. The bottom left, you see in yellow, Najaf, a very holy area, and Karbala, very holy areas for the Shia population, which the Sunni were attacking as well over there, the holy areas. This is an example of the questions we were asking. We asked people, what's your perception of tribal violence happening? This is an example question from that, I'll just go back a screen, from this survey. This is an example of one. Armed groups, doesn't matter who they are, should be disarmed. In other words, do you agree with violence or non-violence? And 59% said they agree that violence is not the solution. On the other hand, are you asking, are they a solution? Should they be disarmed, or are they a solution? The first question is, an armed group bearing arms and using violence, and we've translated this from the Arabic question, armed groups and using violence are not acceptable. However, of that 59%, 15 in the second question said there's still a solution. In other words, the group is a good idea, but the use of violence is not a good idea. The third question was the government of Iraq should find ways to include these groups into the Iraqi army or Iraqi police. And 42% said yes. I mean, for intents and purposes, these people are actually our neighbors, or maybe even us. And when we actually looked at the question, do you think that these armed groups make life safer or more dangerous for you? A lot of people believed it was. The differences which you see below each of these, -16, -5, +22, and all those numbers, is a comparison from the previous month's research. So this actually checked the effectiveness of our psychological warfare operations, of how good we were to break the cycle of tribal violence. And yeah, we found in this month that there was a significant shift at Baghdad from rejection and support towards don't know, no answer, which is very important. You want people to be very much in a gray zone of not liking. We asked another question, for example, protection responsibility. Which do you think currently offers the best security? You, the police, the army, the foreign force, the armed groups, and so forth. The ideal situation is what we have in our own lives in Western society. And that's the police. The police should offer the best security, not the army. Your own bearing of arms, a neighborhood watch, shouldn't be the answer. It should be the police. Who would you turn to first for protection? Unfortunately, we found that 29% turn to friends and relatives. And not the police. Let's actually look at the public perception when we have here, of the 5,054 people we asked, Al-Qaeda is defending Muslims. Is this a religious issue? Is this a cultural issue? Is this a tribal issue? And yeah, we find this, the answers to understanding that. Does Al-Qaeda run a better life or not? I mean, are you looking at this in terms of your daily lifestyle? Or are you just looking at this in terms of religion? Where is that element, ideological, culture, beliefs, understanding of daily life? It's a duty of Muslims to support Al-Qaeda, because this was Al-Qaeda's own propaganda. Yes, everybody has to support Al-Qaeda because it is a duty of Muslims. And we have to break that understanding that it's not. All armed groups should be disarmed wherever they serve. So yeah, we found, looking at the Sunnis, the Shiites, Baghdad, different areas, so looking at the differences, where we should focus our efforts. And we found that Baghdad was 59, but Mosul, for example, was 93. So we found that there was a need actually to focus there as well. Armed groups are a solution to tribal violence because a lot of people understood that this was tribal. And we found also looking once again in Sunni, Shia, Baghdad, and total. And if you look at the yellow box, that's the takeaway. About half the citizens of Baghdad believe that armed groups are not the solution. And this was a shift. But if we looked at another city, for example, Bakuba, 50%, they were going up, believe that they are a solution. So there was a pendulum swing over there. Thing about tribal violence, we actually have to translate this into Arabic. So it's very, very difficult in any type of research, whether it's academic or military, or even in the mass media, is that you see something in one language, but who has translated it? And the understanding in context of the question you are asking being translated so the person who is reading the answer also understands what is being asked. And translation is a very, very difficult thing in doing research and understanding different societies and cultures. Indeed, as anthropologists, we know we're going into a foreign environment, foreign by aspects that is not our home language. And any type of research we're doing in that non-home language environment, we also have to understand the context of the question and the answer. So this was actually very important to get the translation correct of what tribal violence was. Do armed groups make life safe or dangerous as a consequence? And this was also testing our effectiveness. Going into the Iraqi army, Iraqi police was most important, so we could actually physically build up either the army or police forces in each area and each neighborhood to break that cycle of violence. Who provides you better with safety? And yeah, we had to move very much in terms of understanding that 61% of the blocs believed that the international security forces, Americans, believed the best security. But we wanted to shift that in terms of the Iraqi army and police. And this was actually understanding of who we turned first to for protection. In Baghdad, 29% returned to friends and neighbors, only 11% returned to the Iraqi army, and 7% go to the police. So this was not a normal situation in the country. And again, who's responsible for the attacks? So if you ask the Shiite, they would say the Sunni. And if you ask the Sunni, they would say the Shiite. And if you ask both together, they would say the Americans. So there was a bit of coalescence there. Let's look at now at the analysis. So we have cultural anthropology, we find as the study of human society and cultures. We have ethnography, which is the field work which we're doing. And we have two elements coming out of this, which is very important to understand the analysis. That's the sociological and the psychological. Sociological is looking at the quantitative, and cultural anthropology uses qualitative, and the psychological element here is cross-cultural variation. And this was a big screen or output of looking at understanding in terms of the analysis, the big yellow blocks of understanding how each event of violence was either going to be sociological, psychological, cultural, ethnographical, and so forth. So we could actually then look for a solution because we understood the cause of the actual tribal violence in each area and each event that was taking place. We designed an emotional cognitive model to understand of the consequences of how each act of violence had an impact on me, the individual, the impact on us as a society, culture, whether Sunni, Shia, Kurd, or secular. And we were looking to focus our psychological operations onto redirecting the anger away from tribal violence and away from the support of militias. So we built an entire model to understand in each neighborhood how we could counter that. We also had psychological and sociological messaging cycles, which we developed from that to put into our products of psychological warfare operations, of education, the cause effect, and a call to action. And everybody obviously in different phases of understanding, so it was simultaneous to understand a predatory nature of the militia in which each identified with. And we synchronized this in terms of the tribal violence of engagement, understanding, resolution, reinforcement, reinforce trend, minimize transition, reinforce the experience, and the actual behavior. And that led, obviously, in 2007 to an information campaign and a military campaign known as Fakhd al-Khanun, which was also the purchase surge of 180,000 troops into the area to reduce the violence and foster a political statement. So what are the findings? Findings, as we knew when we started from origins, that insurgents with Sunni Shia, Al-Qaeda, or Jassim Mahdi were not military but tribal, and their tactics are not conventional, asymmetrical. And to counter this, we had to have cultural and social knowledge of the adversaries. And breaking the cycle of tribal violence was by winning the hearts and minds. And therefore we had three elements: security, unity, and prosperity. We also wanted to bring people to understanding you could live in a normal, prosperous environment, prosperous not just economic, but also a prosperous society, education and healthcare for your families. And everybody could be united, where a future of Iraq was based upon citizenship and security required to defeating Al-Qaeda, which was the Sunni, and countering the militia, which was the Shia. And we then had a period of each month, we had a different program of operations in terms of psychological warfare operations, where we actually had different sets of TV adverts, op-eds in newspapers, as well as billboards on the street to convince people of how to do this. And we call this drumbeats and explanation. So we'd explosify vulnerabilities of the fact that Al-Qaeda was actually a foreigner. The dismantlement of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, where one side's behind you and closing fast, you will be next, you lose. And exploit the Anbar tribe success. Very successful campaign in the area, the province of Anbar, which is very close to Baghdad. And we actually called that the tribes of Anbar. And the people of Iraq will defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that actually is how we travel. We explain to people, it's the tribes of Anbar will succeed this. We had a campaign to actually get the leadership of Al-Qaeda, Al-Masri, which was very successful, and this was a product which we actually did to understand who supported him and where. We also had a campaign of looking at the Shia neighborhood, which was Sadr City, and how to actually move into the Shia area. And we convinced the leader of the Shia Muslim in Sadr City, Muqtadir al-Sadir, to leave Iraq for 18 months to go back to Iran to study because he was not religiously at the level to be a leader. And this was a turning point. When we convinced the Muqtadir al-Sadir to leave Sadr City in Baghdad to go back to Iran to study, this led to a reduction in violence. This was a different type of research we did, which was atmospheric. So we were actually looking to understand the trends and patterns, because anthropology also looks at to understand how things are constantly changing within culture. So this was a 7-year program, 2003 to 2010. So we had to have the atmospherics to understand, research, and test the various changes. So the research was ongoing. And one example you should see from the top there is Ramadan. What are the differences during a religious month compared to a non-religious month, and how that leads over a different period of years. And we had a dissemination. So each of these, for example, are different campaigns we had of effects in TV, radio, and newspaper. Called one a shadow, an empty street, a wedding, to show people that you are normal people. And if we actually had to look over a long period of time, for example, a period of 14 months, you'll find that the trend was that it moved from 68% or 63% from Sunni or Shia to 86 and 83. So we're very, very successful. The bottom line there is different campaigns. So we were very, very successful in actually achieving this. And these were the objectives, which was to support the efforts of the military. So in other words, what we actually wanted to do was have a stable government in Baghdad where foreign forces could then withdraw. In other words, the withdrawal from Iraq, which happened in 2010. And the reduction objectives was to slowly but surely hand over occupation power to locals when each neighborhood was safe enough for them to actually do so without tribal violence in that neighborhood. And we call that breaking the tribal violence cycle. So this looks very, very much like the first one or two slides which I showed you, which was the bottom-up campaign to achieve that. And the massing of these effects transregionally was looking outside of Iraq. So for example, external Shia influences in Syria, Iran, Lebanon, and Al-Qaeda globally. And this was very, very successful until December 2010. Then there was a change of presidency in the United States, and President Obama called for the withdrawal of all forces, which was implemented and effected. Al-Qaeda migrated to become Islamic State. And as we know, the period from 2011 onwards, Syria and Lebanon fell victim to what was essentially a struggle of the Islamic State. And indeed, the Arab Spring also came at the same time. So things actually blew up in massive proportions. Let me look at the last two slides, which is conclusions, and then I'm going to show you one or two examples of what I mean by our products. So the first one is the conclusions from the case study on the Iraq War. And that is struggle for power and legitimacy among competing tribal factions. There's no pure military solution. In other words, there had to be a different way of doing things. And the reason that has no purely military solution is because there was a failure to understand different local cultures. This is where anthropology came in. The failure to understand different local cultures is a major contributing factor in major multiple national security and intelligence failures. So just to throw a massive amount of forces against an enemy without understanding the culture is actually national security and intelligence failure. And the answer lies not in pouring more troops into concrete ethnic religious jungle. The answer is an anthropological grasp that the battle is tribal violence. And what does this actually mean for us as anthropologists, the conclusion for the theory? Well, whether we like it or not, the case of what happened in Iraq is that anthropology has military applicability. That anthropology now is an essential element, tool, which can be used by the military. That is to understand other societies from the framework. This might be a good thing or a bad thing. Might not really want anthropology to become militarized. May well have become militarized. And understanding that is that in counterinsurgency operations, that tribal violence matters, because one of the central epistemological tenets of anthropology is cultural relativism. And our conclusion for anthropology is that in the military aspect, at least of being militarized, is that understanding and working within the social framework of the social local area is initially the most influential factor in the conduct of counterinsurgency operations dependent upon anthropological data and analysis. And of course, this leads to this important question, is to what extent are troops trained to be able to do this? How many soldiers, officers have this anthropological knowledge? How many have quantitative and qualitative anthropological skills? until 2003, there was only one course ever taught in anthropology at United States Military Academy, West Point, euphemistically called Nuts and Huts. And every other course very much focused on political science as the understanding of the background. In addition to political science, the course was obviously on history to understand context and the data, but anthropology was ignored. And this has changed. So this essentially is what I'm presenting as a PowerPoint, but now I'm going to show you some of these video clips, which is what we broadcast to the population. The sound clip is in Arabic, but we also have English subtitles so you can read it. Obviously, this is being recorded, so there's a video for you to see that. So what I'm actually going to do now is close this, and I'm going to screen share now for you a media player, and I'm going to play for you one or two of these examples. So this is one of them.
ديننا دين رحمة ومحبة، ولنا في رسول الله وخير أسوة. أقاموا العدل والسلام وجاهدوا لنشر الحق. لقد كرم الله كافل اليتيم بأن جعل مقامه في الجنة قريبا من النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. كيف يمكن لمن يستبيح دماء الأبرياء ويخلف آلاف الأيتام أن يطالب بإقامة الخلافة؟ المسلمون والخلافة براء من القهر. العراق يختار الحياة.
So the purpose of that one, which was broadcast on TV on 30 different channels at that stage it was satellite TV, 30 channels available to the local population. And the purpose of that one was actually to try and convince people that the real victims of what was happening in this tribal violence were children. That the Quran, as a religious book, did not in any way sanction or believe that this violence led to the killing of children, which was the future of society. Your children on both sides. And it was very, very effective. What I'm now going to show you is another one. So let me stop sharing that one. And let's go on to this one. This one, and that was very much a something which we would call not to do. But let me actually show you now one which is more a positive.
عليه الصلاة والسلام: لن تجتمع أمتي على ضلالة. كل الأمة صاحت من أجل العراق، كفاكم تقاتلا وتناحرا وتدنيسا للمقدسات باسمنا، لا لمزيد من الإرهاب باسمنا، لا لمزيد من إراقة الدماء باسمنا، لا لمزيد من الافتراءات باسم الإسلام في العراق. نحن الأمة نقول لا للقاعدة. كل الأمة تقول لا للقاعدة. العراق يختار الحياة.
So that one was actually, for all intents and purposes, showing a promising future. That first one was saying, please don't kill because it is destroying your future. But the second one was showing a promising future of what life could be like if you did not support Al-Qaeda. And we had a motto, as you know, a slogan at the very end of all of this program: Iraq bahayti khayay. An Iraqi chooses life, not death. And one of the most important things to understand about Al-Qaeda was it was the exact opposite. And Al-Qaeda chooses death, not life. So that is a conclusion of my 1 hour presentation. Thank you for having viewed and listened to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Segell. Well, I'm sure we have all liked the paper and have delighted the talk by Professor Segell. And so now it's time for questions, maybe some comments. So the floor is open. Who would like to say something? Okay, then
I have a question.
yeah, sure.
So first, again, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask, can we use this framework without the military presence? For example, to repairing the Lebanese society?
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question because you have to look at each individual culture to understand what you can do with it. Now, Lebanon is very interesting because Lebanon actually isn't tribal. Lebanon is families. And this is very, very unique in the Middle East. The entire aspect of what has happened in Lebanon is that over the years, Lebanon was always families, never actually reached a stage of being large tribes. And Lebanon was doing very, very good until the mid-1970s, when an organization that was at that stage based in Jordan, called the PLO, Yasser Arafat, attempted to basically topple the Jordanian government, Black September, and was expelled from Jordan and moved to Lebanon. And they led their attacks from Lebanon into Israel as opposed to from Jordan into Israel. So until the mid-1970s, Lebanon was actually a very good situation. Lebanon was families where there was many, many different religions, including Christianity, which were coexisting. Lebanon was once known as the Riviera, French Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the involvement of the PLO, which led to Israel's first military operation there in 1978, Operation Litani, to expel the PLO. And later on, the 1982 Operation Peaceful Galilee, which in hindsight was called the First Lebanese War, Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon to the Litani River, which is about 30 kilometers, to prevent rockets being launched in northern Israel until 2001. And when the then Prime Minister Ehud Barak had a unilateral withdrawal of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon because they were so attacked, that's when Hezbollah, Iranian-based Shiite forces, moved in. So for all intents and purposes, resolving the situation today in Lebanon has become complex. You have to think about who is supporting Hezbollah locally, the connection between Hezbollah and the external support from Tehran, Iran, and also put that now within the context of what is happening in Syria. Because when Israel was basically invading and occupying southern Lebanon, Syria, the current president's father, Assad, was doing the same to northern Syria. So it was a division of the country between two external intervention military forces, where Israel has withdrawn now, but Hezbollah has moved in. But Syria was controlling the north until the Syrian civil war. Now, for all intents and purposes, you have to add in other external elements, for example, Russia. There is a naval in North Syria, which is now a beautiful port for Russia. This led to Russian support for Syria during its Arab Spring uprising. So it's become very, very complex in terms of external forces. But yes, if you actually want to look locally, using this model, using this framework of anthropological understanding, is to turn to the Lebanese population and say, okay, how do you see your future as a Lebanese? Is that an answer? Is Lebanon still a viable option? Is it still a country which can exist? Or do you identify so strongly with one of these other forces that that's who you are? Is southern Lebanon now Shiite Hezbollah, an independent state for all intents and purposes, which has to split away from the rest of Lebanon? And how do you identify northern Syria? Because for all intents and purposes, Syria is a different type of religion. It's Awali. Has that intervention over decades resulted in a change there? And obviously, once again, still the Christian element there. So you can use this as a starting point, what I've presented today. However, because of the differences of circumstances and the fact that the strongest leadership in Lebanon is families, not tribal, you might well come out with understanding that the route to finding a solution is going to be far different. But it's a way of starting. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Other questions? Other questions or comments? Yes, there is something in chat. So Sergey Kostelanis writes, "Hi Glenn, thank you for the thank you for the presentation. So we are 10 years from then, and we see same or very similar tribal violence and the extremists in Iraq. So what has failed? Who has failed?"
Thank you very much. It's a turning point of understanding that everything is moving in one direction. But then decisions are taken to stop the program we were doing. And that came with the election of President Barack Obama in the United States. So at one point, we actually had $100 million per year involved in moving this forward. And it was a very contentious program because this was a foreign intervention. And it's very much like saying God, glory, and gold of European colonization in Africa. Whose God is it? Whose glory is it? Whose gold it is? And it's not the locals. That's European colonization, the 3 Gs. What we're seeing in Iraq, well, it's exactly the same. Whose intervention to bring about a solution was not the local Iraqis, it was a foreign. And the moment that President Obama cut the budget, was elected, and removed this operation, which we were doing, everything broke out into more intense tribal violence because each sectarian element within there, each tribe within Iraq was struggling to have supremacy over another with foreign intervention, for example, from Iran. While at the same time, everybody else was still trying to protect the Kurds. And the Sunni migrated into ISIS, Islamic State. So what went wrong, first of all, was within a period of 4 to 6 weeks, the termination of this entire program by election of President Obama. It was very much like getting on board ship and leaving them to their own devices. That led to a resurgence of foreign intervention to break the Islamic State. The question is where we are actually leading from this. Because Iraq, for all intents and purposes, like many other countries, is an example of what has become failed governments. Libya is another case which now has 2 governments, Tripoli and Benghazi, as a result of foreign intervention to split the actual power bases. We can say what's happening in Sudan today. We have a government, but we also have rebel forces. You have to say, and I know in Khartoum, I lived in Khartoum as well for 18 months, there's over 260 different tribes living in the Khartoum region of 3 cities of Khartoum, Umdurman, and Bakhri, which make up the 3 parts of the capital area of Khartoum. And there's a struggle there for power. So the same as in Iraq, the same as in Sudan, the same as in Libya, and many, many other countries. The question is, what right does anyone have to intervene to say my lifestyle is better than your lifestyle which you have? And to what extent can anyone locally stand up and say, I am going to be the leader and do something different to be good and better? Now, in some cases, we have seen that. A perfect example might well be Singapore. That in the 1960s, it was nothing. A strong person, a strong leader stood up and turned what was nothing into a viable, important, economic, safe city-state. But he was a dictator, so what? He did good for his people. The question in Baghdad is, this is very important to understand from an anthropological nature as well as a political science nature. Can you break up the state borders of a country created artificially to lead to some sort of better result, whatever it is? In the case of Iraq, that should be the answer. Kurdistan, up north, but then you have to involve Syria and Turkey, is a viable option for that part of Iraq. Down south, which majority are Shiite, that should actually be ceded to Iran. And then you find Baghdad and going westward, which is very much Sunni, would be perfectly successful to have that. And that takes us into two other countries in the world. India-Pakistan artificial partition and creation led to Bangladesh and many wars between India and Pakistan. And the same with Israel and Palestine. An artificial separation based upon religion, which didn't work either. So the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan and Israel and Palestine was the artificial creation of a state with conflicts within its border, which to today has not actually been resolved as a consequence. So from an anthropological, sociological perspective, looking at cultures, religion, sectarian, and tribe, these lines and borders should not be there. And I think that's the entire case for the whole of Africa, actually. Somebody just drew the maps on the border, said, this is you are now a state, but they haven't worked as a consequence. Culture has to be taken into account, tribes have to be taken into account. So that's where we should be going for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, other questions?
Yes, if I may. First of all, thank you very much for a great presentation. It was very, very different from my area of study, but very interesting nevertheless. And I was interested if, to your knowledge, someone does something similar in other areas, in other regions. Like you had this project, and has someone else tried something similar in maybe other regions, maybe also affiliated with American government, maybe with one of the European ones, it doesn't matter, just you've done this work from, what, 2003 to 2010, and after that, has someone done something similar?
Thank you. Yes, the answer is yes. When we stopped basically in Iraq because of the presidential decision making, and I'm not American, but I was coming in from one of the other partner countries. This work was done elsewhere. For example, the United Kingdom progressed to do work about this in East Africa. And this was very important to breaking the pirate maritime situation of the Somali coast in the Indian Ocean. It was to understand the maritime seaward of the landward strife of struggles. And so there was a human terrain operation both in Kenya, Somalia, and Tanzania. More intensely, when President Trump came in, he approved one also in Somalia. And there's also been a French similar operation in the Sahel, where they are looking to understand, basically, you're not going to find a military solution to what's happening in the Sahel, to understand exactly how tribal elements in the Sahel could be, because this is important for French. So a lot of sharing of understanding went between us throughout what was basically east to west coast, sub-Sahara Africa, where there is foreign intervention, whether it be Sahel, whether it be Somalia, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. And this was very much quite a number of companies and projects being involved. And many of these companies are actually very, very open and understanding. So if you look at the time period, literally over the last 20 years, since 2003 to when we started, you'll find a lot of private contractors have been permitted to basically tell the world what they've done. So you'll find a public opinion survey company from Britain called YouGov. did a lot of research and surveys. Bates Pan Gulf was a commercial media company operating in the United Arab Emirates, which made a lot of products. And then there was Margaret Thatcher's famous company, which actually put her into power, Bell Pottinger Sans Frontiers, which has also been operating throughout Africa as well. And Bell Pottinger, or the Bell Corporation, basically have published a lot of work about what's done on the commercial aspects. So you will actually find, if you look further, you'll find a lot more. But those are three companies off the top of my head, which I can say, if you looked into their websites here, I know that YouGov, for example, still operates out of Kurdistan area. It has a public opinion company which does market research over there. A chap called Stefan Kazaboski is in charge of that. Bell Pottinger operating out of Kenya. Paul Bell himself actually spent a lot of time operating out of there as well. And Bell also operated post-apartheid South Africa prior to what we were doing in Iraq. He was Bell Pottinger Company, Bell organization, was very much involved in the transition post-apartheid. And that was because quite a number of their staff there were former journalists with some of the newspapers. And so they led a media campaign for the African National Congress, the ANC, to try and convince the people to have a peaceful coexistence, truth and reconciliation. And it was very, very successful. They took basically 14 tribes in South Africa and said, don't turn to violence. So they prevented the civil war. Very, very successful. They weren't successful thereafter, actually maintaining a strong economy. And since things have descended into crime, violence related to crime, but not political violence. So it was very, very successful, actually, the Truth and Reconciliation led by the Bell Company to prevent tribal violence before it started. Very, very successful. So the answer is yes. Before and after, I've been doing both by commercial companies as well as a lot of Western companies, Western governments have been involved as well.
I see. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. More questions? Or otherwise, I would like to make a couple of observations myself too. So the first one is that, of course, the situation which you described based on actually recent evidence of the 21st century, but the situation is typical for many centuries. So our friend Gleb, who just asked me the previous question, has studied on the based on the evidence from North America, colonial North America. He described in detail how well British colonists and American Indians understood the nature of the war and the nature of military diplomacy, whatever, very differently, and how it influenced, made an important impact on the course of events and the outcome of the events. And the second point is that, well, actually, in practical terms, how to bring anthropology to the military. Well, we know that applied anthropology today is a very important part of, well, applied anthropologists are very important parts of huge companies, well, so on and so forth. But how to make anthropology important for the military? I'm recalling several stories. Well, the first one is from America. Well, there was an American anthropologist of, if I'm not mistaken, Afghani or Arabic origin, who drafted the army, well, and went to Afghanistan just to explain American soldiers the well, basics of the local culture in order to just to help them avoid avoid problems in communication with local people, and he was killed during the war. Another story is from my American colleague who told me that he's an African, is that once he was called by people from the CIA and they invited him to give a lecture, to deliver a lecture for their agents who were to go to West Africa to struggle against Islamists there. And my friend said he did not accept their invitation, had not accepted it because he was sure they would never take him seriously. And the third story, one of my now late university teachers many decades ago told me, I cannot check it, but he told me that Soviet anthropologists warned Soviet military leaders against penetrating into Afghanistan, just arguing that it would not be possible to gain a victory in such a tribal country. So in practical terms, do you see any prospects for changing the situation you have described so brilliantly in so much detail? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a wide spectrum of issues, which we can look backwards to, for example, the Thucydides Millennium Dialogue, looking at the various wars, the Peloponnesian Wars in Greece thousands of years ago. One of the most important statements made in the Millennium Dialogue is, why is it better for you to be subservient to me than to try to fight me? And we obviously know the difference between Athens and Sparta, where one was a very militarized society, another one was very art and culture, less militarized. And the debate between these two different cultures led to aggression. But the objective was not to destroy the culture, it was to have the culture being controlled by the other one. So we can go even further back than the work done on colonization. For all intents and purposes, the war between the city-states in Greece provides us with interesting narratives and meta-narratives which we can use to analyze, to understand the difference between human nature of one culture, one tribe, trying to control another one, not by the use of force, by trying to convince them not to resort to force. Not very successful, because at the end of the day, when you're not actually winning on the battlefield, or you're not winning off the battlefield, for example, diplomacy, it is human nature to try and use force. So for all intents and purposes, frustration and the lack of dialogue can actually lead to that violence. But it also might just be because of the fact that you don't understand the translation. And the translation might also be in context. So the other side might be saying, yes, one piece, but the way they are saying it, the language they're using, this is very important in linguistic anthropology, is not understood by the first side. And as a consequence, that actually leads to the conflict. But how do we actually introduce this into the military? I think it's very, very important, actually, is that everybody comes from their own background. And the very origins of the background is education at home. And then it is your primary and secondary schooling. And then it is the education you receive in tertiary education, universities. So background at home in primary and secondary is very much fixed because there is no choice. This is what you are born into, and you're going to a school which might be a state school or religious school, and it's fixed. And for those who receive a university education, they make a decision of what they want to study. This is why I pointed out that until 2003, there was only one course at the United States Military Academy West Point called Nuts and Huts on anthropology. All the officers, it's an undergraduate degree, were studying history, political science, and other things. No one was studying anthropology. To bring this into the military is basically to turn to the military and say, not necessarily a degree in anthropology, but you should have more courses on offer in anthropology. You should have more elective courses. You should be introducing more anthropological understanding into other courses. For example, history being between kings or governments is political science history. It's a rule of government. You should be introducing into the history courses the society, the cultural element to understand causes and what has happened. So this is how we can introduce anthropology into the mindset of officers' decision-making based upon their education. And the same for leaders. We turn to leaders of countries which in an elected world and say, what is the background of these people? In many cases, it might be failed lawyers, it might be journalists, but how many of them have actually ever studied political science? I find very few. I mean, you get to sort of get the exception. Henry Kissinger was a Secretary of State who studied political science, exception. How many elected people in cabinets, in presidencies, prime ministerships around the world have ever studied anthropology? They're not in that mindset to understand culture, society, and everything else which goes with anthropology when they're making that decision. And that's, I think, is education, is how the change comes into effect. You might actually see this in the migration of the humanities and social sciences. Once upon a time was diplomacy, then came political science, and only in the early 60s did the field of international relations come. During the 1990s, the field of globalization became popular. So I think that there's a need to actually popularize the field of anthropology in education, educational facilities, in courses. And that, I think, is the way forward to actually doing it. Otherwise, it's still going to be on the sidelines, really. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to say something or to ask Professor Segell about something, to ask something? Well, if no, well, then let me say thank you to Professor Segell once again. Thank you very much indeed. It was our great pleasure to listen to you, and I hope we will keep in touch. Well, and all the very best to you and to everyone who has joined us today. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.